It is 1944. The war in the Pacific is tearing men apart island by island. On Saipan, on Peleliu, in the sulfuric hell of Iwo Jima, American riflemen are doing something no soldier in any other army in the world can do. They are firing semi-automatically, 8 shots before any German, any Japanese soldier can work a bolt. And when that 8th round fires, when that brass clip launches itself from the receiver with a distinctive metallic ping, the American soldier reaches into his ammunition pouch, loads a new clip in under 3 seconds, and keeps shooting. But here's the question that military historians and firearms engineers have debated for 80 years. If the M1 Garand was already that good, the rifle General George Patton himself called the greatest battle implement ever devised, why did it never receive the one upgrade that seemed obvious? Why, throughout 4 years of total war, did millions of American infantrymen carry a rifle that held only 8 rounds, loaded from a fixed internal clip, when the technology for a detachable box magazine had existed for decades? The answer reaches back 15 years before the first shot of the Second World War, and it involves a Canadian immigrant working alone at a bench in Springfield, Massachusetts, a bureaucratic decision made out of logistical desperation and a race against time that the Japanese emperor himself would ultimately end. If you want more stories like this, the hidden decisions, the engineering choices, and the human beings behind the weapons of the Second World War, subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell, new episodes every week. The story begins not with John Garand, but with the problem he was handed. By 1919, the United States Army had emerged from the First World War knowing 2 things with absolute certainty. First, the bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifle, beautiful, accurate, beloved by marksmen, was no longer adequate for modern infantry warfare. The speed of industrial-era combat, the density of enemy fire, the demand for volume as well as precision, had exposed the bolt-action's fundamental limitation: 1 round per cycle of the shooter's hand. Second, the Army had absolutely no money. Congress had slashed the military budget to near nothing in the post-war years. The Ordnance Department was expected to develop the future of American infantry firepower on a shoestring, using existing tooling wherever possible, and, critically, consuming the tens of millions of .30-06 Springfield cartridges still sitting in government warehouses from the war that had just ended. Into this environment stepped Jean Garand, a French-Canadian engineer who had emigrated to the United States, become a naturalized citizen, and joined the Springfield Armory in November 1919. Garand was not a soldier. He had never carried a rifle into combat. What he was a mechanical genius, patient, systematic, tireless, who spent his evenings and weekends designing on his own time because the problem genuinely fascinated him. For the next 15 years, Garand would produce a succession of semi-automatic rifle prototypes, each one inching closer to what the Army needed. He experimented with primer-actuated systems, then gas-operated systems. He tried different calibers, different bolt designs, different magazine configurations. Some of his early designs held 20 to 30 rounds in a detachable magazine, an arrangement he believed, from the beginning, was the correct solution. A box magazine was fast to load, fast to replace, and kept dirt away from the cartridges until the moment of feeding. But Garand was not designing in a vacuum. He was designing to a specification, and the specification said no. The Ordnance Department's resistance to the detachable box magazine was not irrational, even if history has sometimes made it look that way. Their objections were rooted in hard experience with the reliability of early detachable magazines in field conditions. Detachable box magazines of the 1920s and early 1930s had a well-documented tendency to be lost, dropped in mud, misplaced in the chaos of combat, left behind in a hasty retreat. Once lost, the rifle became a single-shot weapon, useless in a firefight. And the magazine well, that opening in the underside of the receiver, was considered a direct path for dirt, mud, and moisture into the weapon's mechanism. In the trench warfare experience the Army had just lived through, a jammed rifle was a death sentence. There was also an aesthetic and tactical concern that seems strange in retrospect, but was genuinely held by senior officers. A protruding magazine beneath the stock made the prone firing position more awkward. Infantrymen lying flat under fire would be raised slightly by the magazine, their silhouette slightly larger, their stability slightly reduced. So the Ordnance Department demanded that the new semi-automatic rifle have a fixed, internal, non-protruding magazine. Whatever the feeding mechanism, it had to remain entirely within the outline of the stock. This was the constraint that shaped everything that followed. John Garand was not the only engineer working on the problem. His most formidable competitor was John Pedersen, a designer of almost supernatural skill, whose work General John Pershing had once called the most remarkable contribution to small arms development in decades. Pedersen had conceived an entirely new cartridge for the competition, the .276 Pedersen, a round shorter and lower pressure than the 3006, specifically designed to make the engineering of a reliable semi-automatic action easier. Pedersen had also devised the solution to the internal magazine problem, the en-bloc clip. Rather than feeding rounds from a detachable magazine, the en-bloc system loaded an entire clip of ammunition, cartridges, metal retainer, and all, directly into the rifle's fixed internal magazine. When the last round was chambered and fired, the clip was automatically ejected from the receiver, leaving it empty and ready for the next load. It was an elegant solution. Pedersen's rifle, chambered in .276 and feeding from a 10-round en-bloc clip, performed brilliantly in the 1929 trials. The Service Rifle Selection Board declared it the clear winner. And then Douglas MacArthur intervened. In February 1932, the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, ordered all development of the .276 Pedersen cartridge to cease immediately. His reasoning was purely logistical and entirely correct. The Army held vast stockpiles of .3006 ammunition from the First World War. Every existing support weapon, the Browning automatic rifle, the M1917 and M1919 machine guns, was chambered in .3006, creating an entirely new supply chain, new production tooling, new warehouse infrastructure for a new caliber would be time-consuming and expensive beyond what the Depression-era defense budget could absorb. MacArthur's order killed Pedersen's rifle. The .276 was a weapon designed for the .276 round and nothing else. It could not be reconfigured. Garand's design could. Working in parallel, Garand had always kept a .30 caliber version of his rifle developing alongside the .276 variant. When the caliber decision came down, Garand's team adapted. The larger .3006 cartridge required changes. The clip capacity had to be reduced from 10 to 8 rounds to accommodate the larger case, but the fundamental mechanism survived. By 1933, the modified design had impressed the evaluation boards sufficiently to receive a provisional designation. On January 9, 1936, it was formally adopted as the United States Rifle, caliber .30 M1. John Garand received no royalties. He transferred all rights to the United States government. For the rifle that would arm America through its most desperate war, he collected his government engineer's salary and nothing more. By the time production began in earnest, Garand had accepted what the Ordnance Department had imposed upon him. The en-bloc clip system was a fait accompli. The requirement for a fixed, internal magazine had been the price of adoption. The 8-round en-bloc was the solution that satisfied every constraint. It was reliable, it kept the magazine internal and non-protruding, it was fast to load with practice, and it worked under the brutal conditions of field service. What it was not was unlimited. 8 rounds was 8 rounds. Against an enemy who carried 30-round magazines, as German soldiers sometimes did with their captured Soviet weapons, or as American paratroopers would eventually carry with the M1 carbine, 8 rounds seemed thin. But in practice, the limitation proved less decisive than it appeared on paper. American infantrymen trained extensively with the en-bloc system. A practiced soldier could reload the M1 in under 3 seconds, comparable to or faster than many contemporary soldiers exchanging detachable magazines, especially under fire, with cold or wet hands, against the clock of incoming rounds. The rifle's semi-automatic action meant that those 8 rounds could be delivered with far greater speed and accuracy than any bolt action could manage. German officers who encountered American units equipped with M1 Garands repeatedly noted the volume and rapidity of American individual fire as a disorienting tactical factor. a perception that contributed directly to the tactical reputation the rifle built across every theater. The legendary ping of the ejected clip, the subject of every barracks myth about American soldiers being heard reloading, was investigated by ordnance engineers during the war itself. Studies determined that the sound was effectively inaudible beyond a very short distance in the acoustic environment of actual combat. The battlefield was simply too loud. The story persisted, but the evidence did not support it. John Garand, for his part, had never stopped thinking about the detachable magazine. In October 1944, working under pressure from field commanders who had seen the German STG-44 assault rifle and the Japanese Type 99 with larger magazines, he completed a new design. Designated the T-20, it was essentially a rebuilt M1 receiver capable of select-fire operation, both semi-automatic and fully automatic, fed from a 20-round detachable box magazine adapted from the Browning automatic rifle. The T-20 was, in many ways, the rifle Garand had always wanted to build. The Army tested it, engineers evaluated it, field commanders reviewed the reports, and in May 1945, the Ordnance Technical Committee took the decisive step. It recommended procurement of 100,000 T-20E2 rifles, a production order that, once placed, would effectively replace the M1 Garand on the front lines. The first production-ready examples of the T-20E2 were completed in June 1945. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The Ordnance Technical Committee shelved the T-22 procurement that same month. The war was over. The urgency had evaporated. There was no longer a front line waiting for the rifle. 100,000 T-20E2 rifles that had been ordered, that had been engineered, that were ready to be built, were never purchased. The M1 Garand, in its original 8-round configuration, remained the standard American service rifle. There is a particular kind of irony in the T-20 story that rewards careful consideration. The detachable magazine was not rejected because it failed. It was not rejected because engineers couldn't solve the technical problems. It was not rejected because soldiers didn't want it. It was shelved because the enemy surrendered before the factories could deliver it. The M1 Garand went to Korea in 1950, still chambered for 8 rounds, still loading from the en-bloc clip that John Pedersen had designed 15 years before the war, and that the Ordnance Department had insisted upon before Garand had even finalized his receiver. American soldiers on the frozen ridgelines of the Chosin Reservoir carried the same fundamental loading mechanism that their fathers had carried on the beaches of Normandy. It would not be until 1957, 12 years after the end of the Second World War, 21 years after the M1's adoption, that the Army finally replaced it with the M14. The M14 fired a different cartridge, the new NATO standard 7.62 51mm. But its internal operating mechanism, its rotating bolt, its gas system, all of it descended directly from the T-20 work that Garand had done in 1944. The M14 had a 20-round detachable box magazine. It was, in every essential respect, the rifle Garand had wanted to build in 1932. John Garand retired from the Springfield Armory in 1953, 4 years before his rifle's replacement was adopted. He had spent 34 years designing weapons for the United States government. He received no royalties for the 5.5 million M1 rifles produced during his lifetime. Congress considered a bill to award him $100,000 in recognition of his contribution. The bill did not pass. He was awarded the Medal for Merit in 1944. He was given the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 1941. In 1973, the year before his death, he was inducted into the United States Army Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame. He died in Springfield, Massachusetts on February 16, 1974, at the age of 86, in the city where he had spent his working life, at the armory where, in the evenings, on weekends, on his own time, he had built the rifle that a Supreme Allied commander called the greatest battle implement ever devised. He never got rich. He got the history. The en-bloc clip of the M1 Garand was not an accident, and it was not ignorance. It was the product of competing institutional pressures, logistical realities, and engineering compromises made under the conditions of the 1930s, a decade of economic depression, military underfunding, and genuine uncertainty about what the next war would look like. The men who made those decisions were working with what they had, against constraints that were real, in a world that had not yet shown them the Stalingrad meat grinder or the Pacific Island assault. When the war finally came, the M1 performed beyond what anyone had the right to expect from a 1930s design. It outshot every bolt-action rifle in every theater where it was employed. It gave the American infantrymen a decisive individual fire advantage that no other nation's foot soldier possessed. It was reliable, robust, and accurate at ranges where the enemy needed to be engaged. And when John Garand, at last free from the Ordnance Department's 30-year-old requirement for an internal magazine, sat down to build the rifle with a detachable box magazine, the T-20, the weapon he had always believed was the right answer, he had it ready in October 1944. The atomic bomb arrived first. History has a particular way of deciding which inventions matter and which arrive too late. The M1 Garand, 8 rounds and a metal ping in all, arrived exactly on time. The T-20 arrived after the last gun had fired. Both of them were John Garand's rifles. Only one of them changed the war. If this story changed the way you think about the weapons of the Second World War, the decisions behind them, the men who built them, the bureaucratic forces that shaped them, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to this channel for more military history that goes beyond the battles and into the engineering rooms, the design bureaus, and the proving grounds where the outcome of the war was decided before the first shot was fired. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling us which weapon story you want to hear next, and activate the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Because the weapons of history were never just weapons. They were arguments made in steel,